White modeling chocolate. Today we're making white modeling chocolate, and the first thing we have to do is melt some white chocolate. The white chocolate, you want to be very careful as you're melting that. You only want to melt it to a temperature of 85 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, being very careful to make sure that all of the chocolate has melted down completely before we add the next ingredient for this, and the next ingredient is basically going to be corn syrup. The corn syrup that we're adding to this white modeling chocolate also needs to be heated, and it needs to be heated to that same 90-degree temperature that the chocolate is. You want to get all that mixed in. Now, when you start mixing this corn syrup into the white chocolate, you want to be very careful and stir in only one direction, and you want to just stir this just until the ingredients are combined. Do not overmix it. If you overmix it, sometimes you start to get the cocoa butter to actually start to coming out of the white chocolate, which is not a good thing because then your modeling chocolate doesn't exactly work out that well. So you want to be very careful as you're stirring this and stir it only until it comes together. Once you see that you're not getting any stripes and your chocolate's starting to get a little bit thicker, you're almost to the point that you need to stop stirring. You're going to see a texture change, and it's actually going to get thicker. Once it starts getting thicker, make sure that you don't see any striations. Get it blended in very well, but again, do not over mix because it's very easy to do. As you can see, the texture of this has gotten really thick. I'm not seeing any striations in the chocolate anymore, so we're just about where we want to be. It's nice and thick, kind of gooey looking. Perfect. Now what we need to do is we need to go ahead and wrap this up in some plastic wrap. And when you wrap it up in plastic wrap, you want to make sure that you wrap this up very tightly because, believe it or not, the modeling chocolate will actually dry out when it is exposed to air. So you want to make sure and get that wrapped very tightly. Get it all out of the bowl. And then take the plastic and make sure that you have it wrapped and make sure you don't have any air bubbles in there. And your white modeling chocolate should be all ready. You're going to put it to bed, and it'll be wonderful to work with tomorrow. Today we're going to be making dark modeling chocolate. And the first thing we need to do is melt the dark chocolate. Now the dark chocolate needs to reach a temperature of about 110 degrees Fahrenheit. This takes a few minutes, so we may have to wait a little bit. You want to keep stirring your chocolate the whole time that you're melting it. You want to melt it over simmering water and not really boiling water, but just simmering water, just enough to get the chocolate to melt. The next ingredient that we're going to be adding is going to be corn syrup. As this chocolate is melting, we're going to keep stirring it the whole time. That way it doesn't overheat or get too hot in one area or the next. Now that our chocolate is nice and melted, I've reached a temperature of 110 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're almost ready to put in the next ingredient, which is the corn syrup. Now the corn syrup that we're adding to this dark chocolate today is at the same temperature that the chocolate is, which is 110 degrees Fahrenheit. We need to go ahead and add that to the dark chocolate. And then once we get it all into the dark chocolate, then we need to start folding the corn syrup into the dark chocolate, being very careful not to overmix it. As this is being mixed, you can see the striations of the corn syrup being mixed into the dark chocolate. You want to more or less get rid of those striations, so you want to stir this all in one direction just until all those striations have disappeared. And it takes a few minutes to get this folded in. You need to make sure to get up underneath the chocolate as well as go around the outside of the bowl, just to make sure that it's going to be blended in a nice even fashion. So you keep stirring. As it's stirring, you can see this kind of striation, so you know you need to keep stirring it. Eventually it's going to start getting thicker. It's starting to get a little bit thicker now, but we're going to continue stirring this until it starts to kind of come together, and then it's actually going to start really holding on to itself. There's still a few more spots that we need to get incorporated into it. So we'll keep stirring. It's very important that you want to stir this just until the corn syrup has been incorporated into the dark chocolate and that it gets nice and thick. As you can see right now, it's starting to get pretty thick. We don't want to overmix it. We do want to make sure that it's all incorporated in there though. So take a good look at it just to make sure that it's all incorporated. Now we're ready to go ahead and wrap this dark chocolate up. I'm basically taking it out of the bowl and putting it onto some plastic wrap on the table there, getting all the chocolate out. As we're wrapping this chocolate up, you want to go ahead and wrap the chocolate until it is, or wrap the chocolate very airtight. You don't want to have any air bubbles or any air pockets in with the chocolate. Any air pockets, it'll actually start to dry out the chocolate a little bit. So you want to make sure that you get all the air out and wrap it up very tight. This one's almost ready to go to bed. And we'll see it in the morning and it should be all wonderful.
Modeling chocolate. We're going to make some decorations out of some modeling chocolate today. I'm going to show you how to make some roses out of the modeling chocolate. The first one I'm going to show you is going to be out of the white modeling chocolate, but I've got the rose in the various stages in which we're actually going to put the roses together. The first thing you're going to notice, both of the modeling chocolates are very similar after you've made them and after they've sat overnight. When I broke this piece off, you'll see that it looks kind of ugly, and that is okay, because we're actually going to have to knead that together to bring that together. It is a little bit hard, but you can bring this together. It'll be a nice smooth paste at the end. If it's really hard, you might want to break it up into smaller pieces and work with a small piece at a time and just kind of lean on it and really give it some pressure. It will get to a moldable consistency. Okay, other piece in there. Now work with this either on a marble surface or a stainless steel surface. Just make sure that if you're working with white, that the table be very clean. Okay, and there's probably going to be times that I'm going to have to scrape the table off to get rid of all the excess stuff that's left on the table, and that's okay. But as I'm kneading this, it seems to be getting a lot softer, a lot smoother, so it's easier to work with now. Okay? So now I'm going to go ahead and start the process of making the different parts of the rose. The first part that I make is basically the cone or the base of the rose, but most of the pieces that I cut are all going to be the same. Now, as you're working with the white or the dark, especially the white, if you work with it too much or you try to knead it too much, you're actually going to get it to start to separate. The cocoa butter is actually going to start coming out of the chocolate. So just work it till it's soft enough to where it feels nice and consistent in its feel, that it's nice and moldable. So what I did first was I kind of snaked it out on the table, and now I'm cutting pieces that are all relatively close to being the same size. Okay, now when I make roses, I start off with that cone or the base, and then I start wrapping petals around, and the petals that I put on are always going to go on in odd numbers. Now to make the base, I've basically just taken one of the pieces, I'm going to round it in my hand, okay, just to get it nice and smooth, and then I just take the heel of my hand and kind of roll one side. That way I end up with this funny looking cone, basically. Okay, so I'll do a couple of those just so we can have something to work with. This one may be a little bit small, but you want it to kind of point just a little bit, because as I'm rolling the petals around this, I want to be able to not roll the petals so tight that I'm not going to actually be able to see this cone through there. With the rest of the petals that I'm going to do, first thing I do is I go ahead and round them out and just kind of flatten them out. I may have to flatten them out just a little bit more. Just kind of get them all in the same shape for now. Now I am wearing gloves for this particular process because a lot of times when you're doing these type of decorations, they're going to be going on a cake or on a dessert, and there's no cooking process involved, so you have to handle it very carefully, observing all the sanitation rules that are in place. To start making the petals, you can just take one of the balls and just kind of flatten it out a little bit against the table. The only piece of equipment I'm going to be using for this is basically just a plain spatula. And what I'm going to do with this plain spatula is I'm going to start working it. And as you can see, I kind of bend my spatula a little bit. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be hitting just the edge of that with my spatula just to kind of smooth out one side, or to kind of thin out one side. And that gives you the illusion of it being a very delicate petal. Now the base of this is still relatively fat on the bottom here, and it's very thin on top. If it's not thin enough, you can always work it just a little bit with your fingers, okay? Let me get a couple of these, that way I can start a rose going. But all I'm doing is just kind of gently hitting that piece of chocolate just to flatten out the edge. You want it to stick to the table a little bit, and then you just kind of scrape it off, no problem. If it's got some lumps on it, just kind of press them in, okay? But you want just the top side thinned out. And that's going to give you just basically a more delicate looking flower, even though it's really not a delicate flower. There's still quite a bit of heft to this. Okay, so I've got enough to get one rose going. The first petal I take, and the thinner side is on in front of me. When I go to put this on my cone, I want to lay this in such a way that I've got a little bit of room at the top, and I want to roll this on there very tight. In other words, you do not want to see the cone in the middle. I roll it around most of the way around, and then I stop short and kind of open it up just a little bit. And there you have what I call the scarf for that particular rose. Okay. To proceed with the petals, instead of putting petals on one at a time, I go ahead and press the petals together, to get them stuck together at the bottom. I press them going from right to left. The left one's actually on the bottom. There are a lot of different techniques. If that doesn't work for you, that's okay. You can do it the other way. It really doesn't matter. When I go to lay the next set, I've got the scarf on this one. You'll notice that the petals that I'm putting on the top, or around the scarf, is slightly higher than that center. The reason is, when I go to bend these petals down to make it look more like a rose, it's going to basically end up being in about the right position. Before I get too far, I want to go ahead and kind of curl the first petal down just a little bit. Continue moving it around. Kind of fold that rose a little bit. Now when I make roses, or when you make roses, everybody's roses are going to look different, and that's going to happen. Basically what you want to do is you want to kind of curl the petals just a little bit. If they don't look exactly like mine, that's okay. My roses are fairly consistent in the way that they look, but everybody who makes roses, they're all going to be slightly different, and that's okay, because nothing in nature is the same. Okay. Now I will say that the white chocolate is a little bit softer to work with once you get it working. So these petals were a lot softer than the chocolate petals were when I started working those. If you give these a little bit of time, they will firm up a little bit more, and it's not going to be a problem. As you're working with these, if you have a lot of pieces worked up, ready to go, you might want to consider keeping these wrapped in plastic wrap, because this molding chocolate actually dries and firms up at room temperature. It kind of dries out. So you want to keep that covered as best you can. If you're doing a lot, if you're working with it pretty fast, you don't have to worry about it. There are a lot of different techniques for making these rose petals, and everybody has their own technique. This method just happens to work for me. If you find a better method that works for you, that's fantastic. Go ahead and get 5 petals flattened out to do the last set. Generally with roses, I stop at 5 unless you want a very large rose, and then the next one set is going to be 7, so it's always in odd numbers: 1, 3, 5, 7. So I'll take these rose petals, kind of lay them together and kind of pinch them together at the bottom. That way they're all together. Some videos that I've watched for putting flowers together, they put on one petal at a time, and I find that kind of difficult to work with. And again, these petals slightly higher than the set that you just put on. That way, once they get bent down a little bit, they'll all be more or less the same level. You can always manipulate these just a little bit. Okay. Now, if you were going to put these roses on a cake, depending on how they're going on the cake, I usually leave the base a little bit thick, a little bit large and bulky. That way, if you want to lean the flower over to where it looks like it's just laying on top of the cake, you can actually cut this at an angle and it would lay down flat. Or if you want them to sit up right, you can cut the base somewhat flat and set it flat on the cake. But those are the options that you can do for making roses. As you can see, the dark chocolate has that same consistency of the white did. When I broke it off the main piece after letting it set, it looks kind of ugly and you think this will never come together. If you just kind of knead this just a little bit, it will come together. Right now I'm going to make some leaves for you. And as you can see, this chocolate initially, when you start to knead it, it's really tough. It starts to crack up and you think this will never come together. But the warmth of your hand, the act of kneading it together, will actually soften it up and bring it together, and it'll stop cracking on you. Just have to have a little bit of patience with this. And the dark chocolate you can work with a little bit more than the white chocolate as far as your kneading goes. The white chocolate, you really have to be careful. The more you knead it, the more apt the cocoa butter is to start separating out of it. The dark chocolate, I've had not as much of a problem with that. Once it starts to kind of come together and it looks like it's going to hold together and stop cracking, okay? To cut leaves, again, I kind of do the same method. I'll go ahead and rope this out. Now, since I'm making leaves, I'm going to make a slightly larger piece because I'm actually going to be cutting leaves out of this. Now, there's a lot of different techniques of making leaves. So with this particular chocolate, with the modeling chocolate, I don't concern myself too much with trying to get the edges really flat. I do to a certain extent, but there's 2 different methods you can actually use to make leaves. Number 1, you could use a leaf cutter. If you have a leaf cutter, that works great. You can get a more consistent leaf out of that. If you don't have a leaf cutter, you can always use a knife. Now, instead of cutting on my marble, I'll just go ahead and use the back side of my knife and just kind of cut kind of a leaf shape out. So you don't need necessarily any specialized pieces of equipment to make leaves. You don't need any cutters. The edges are a little bit thick, so I'm going to kind of thin those down just to kind of give the illusion that the edges are very delicate. Now, to put the veining on there, you can use a simple paring knife. They also make leaf presses that you can use to actually press a design on that leaf, and that works well too.
Okay.
To cut a leaf with the leaf cutter, Leaf cutters come in a variety of different shapes and sizes. This is kind of a generic leaf. But again, I just kind of flattened out one of my disc of dough. Go ahead and cut it. And since the edges look a little thick or a little bit bulky, just kind of press those out with your fingers just a little bit, just to kind of smooth those out a little bit. And again, to put the leaf veining on there, just kind of press that down a little bit, okay? And then you can just go ahead and just kind of give them a little bit of a shape, okay? Now these, when you finish doing all of your roses, you'll do a bunch of leaves that have shapes. They'll start to firm up a little bit. You can just kind of press them together, or you can actually melt some chocolate and temper it and actually put them on, okay? To give you an example of what it's going to look like, I'm going to cut the base off this a little bit to bring it down to where it will actually sit on top of the cake. Go ahead and press the leaves in on the bottom. You can kind of see how that's going to sit on a cake, whether you're doing dark, white, the choice is yours. There's a lot of different options you can do. But tempered chocolate you can actually use to stick these together with.